The light that never should have been on. My wife and I once owned a little general store on the edge of Ashford, Kentucky. It wasn't much by most people's standards. A white clapboard building with faded green shutters, a weathered wooden porch, and a brass bell above the front door that greeted every customer with a cheerful ring. But to us, it was more than a business. It was where our life together truly began. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Leave your city, state, or country in the comments. It truly means a lot to see how far these stories reach. If you had known my wife, Eleanor, you would have remembered her, not because she was loud or outgoing, but because she had a way of making people feel important. She greeted every customer by name, remembered exactly how they liked their coffee, and somehow always knew when a family was going through hard times. More than once, I caught her quietly leaving a bag of groceries on someone's porch after closing. She never wanted recognition. She'd simply smile and say, "Neighbors look after each other." That's how small towns survive. Every Saturday morning, she'd arrive before sunrise to bake fresh cinnamon rolls in the tiny kitchen at the back of the store. Before we even unlocked the front door, the warm scent of cinnamon and fresh bread drifted down the sidewalk, drawing people inside before they had planned to stop. Those were the years we thought would never end. But life has a habit of changing the plans we believe are permanent. When I was offered a management position with a manufacturing company in Cincinnati, I convinced myself it was the right decision. Better pay, better opportunities, a brighter future for our children. We leased a store, packed our lives into a moving truck, and promised we'd return one day. One day quietly became 31 years. Retirement came and went before I realized how much time had slipped away. Yet there was one thing that never changed. Eleanor kept driving back to Ashford, 5, sometimes 6 times every year. Whenever I asked why, she'd smile and say, "I'm just checking on the old place." I never asked another question. Looking back now, that's the regret I carry more than any other. I spent 30 years asking about bills, work, doctor's appointments, and the grandchildren, but never once asked why my wife kept making those long trips alone. 8 months ago, cancer took her from me. The silence she left behind settled into every room of our house. 3 weeks after the funeral, my son David spread a stack of property papers across my kitchen table. "Dad," he said, "that old store's been sitting there for decades. It's costing you money every year. It's time to sell it." My daughter, Emily, agreed. "It's only a building," she said softly. "Mom wouldn't want you holding on to the past." Maybe they were right. I decided I'd make one final trip. I'd gather anything Eleanor had left behind, lock the door for the last time, and hand the keys to a realtor. Early Tuesday morning, I packed a cooler with sandwiches and coffee, climbed into my pickup, and drove south toward Kentucky. By late afternoon, I turned onto familiar street. There it stood. The little store looked older, but unmistakably familiar. The paint had faded, and the porch showed its age. Then something stopped me cold. The porch light was on. I gripped the steering wheel. I'd installed that light myself more than 30 years earlier, and I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I hadn't left it on. As I sat there trying to make sense of it, the brass bell above the front door chimed softly. The door slowly opened. A broad-shouldered man, wearing a work apron, stepped onto the porch, looked directly at me, and gave me a calm, knowing smile. "Mr. Carter," he called, "I've been expecting you." How could a complete stranger know my name? And why did he sound so certain my late wife had told him I would return? The answer waiting behind that old door would change everything I thought I knew about the woman I loved. The man my wife never told me about. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The afternoon breeze stirred the old flag hanging beside the porch, and the brass bell above the door gave a soft, familiar chime. The man stood there calmly, as though he'd been expecting this moment for a very long time. "I think you got the wrong person," I finally said as I stepped out my truck. He offered a gentle smile. "No, sir, you're Walter Carter." The certainty in his voice sent a chill through me. "And you are—" "My name is Daniel Brooks." He stepped aside and held the door open. "Please come inside. There's something your wife wanted you to understand." The word stopped me cold. Inside, the store felt strangely alive. The old oak counter Eleanor and I had built together still stood in the same place, its surface worn smooth by decades of hard-working hands. The cedar shells gleamed as if they'd been polished that very morning, and fresh flowers rested beneath the front window. Sunlight streamed through the glass, filling the room with the same warm glow Eleanor had always loved. Then I caught it, the faint smell of cinnamon. For just a heartbeat, I was 28 again, watching Eleanor pull a tray of cinnamon rolls from the oven with flour on her cheek. She laughed every time I stole one before it cooled, pretending to scold me while secretly setting aside the biggest roll, just for me. The memory disappeared as quickly as it came. I looked around the room. This place, I whispered, it shouldn't look like this. Daniel nodded. It never stopped being cared for. He disappeared into the little kitchen and returned with 2 mugs of coffee. He handed one to me without asking how I liked it. Black, exactly the way Eleanor always served it. You knew my wife, I said quietly. He lowered his eyes. Yes, sir. How well? He hesitated before answering. Well enough to know she'd never forgive me if I let this place fall apart. A knot formed in my chest. Why didn't she ever tell me? The question slipped out before I realized I'd spoken. I wasn't even sure whether I was asking Daniel or asking myself. He remained silent, giving the question the respect it deserved. After a moment, he took a slow breath. 11 years ago, I came to Ashford with nothing. I'd lost my contracting business. My marriage had ended. I was sleeping in my pickup because I didn't have anywhere else to go. There was no self-pity in his voice, just honesty. One rainy afternoon, your wife knocked on my truck window. I could picture it without trying. Eleanor had always noticed the people everyone else walked past. She didn't ask what I'd done wrong, Daniel continued. She didn't ask if I deserved help. She asked one simple question. Have you eaten today? I closed my eyes. That sounded exactly like Eleanor. Daniel smiled softly. After we talked for a while, she pointed to this old store and said, a building only dies when people stop filling it with kindness. I think this place still has plenty left to give, and maybe so do you. I stared at him, unable to speak. For years, I believed Eleanor kept coming back because she couldn't let go of an old building. Now I was beginning to understand. She hadn't been holding on to a store. She'd been holding on to a promise. Daniel glanced toward the staircase, leading upstairs before looking back at me. Mr. Carter, your wife left something here for you. It wasn't meant to be opened until you came back yourself. He walked toward the old counter and slowly reached beneath it. When he stood again, he was holding a small cedar box. The moment I saw it, my heart skipped. I'd made that box with my own hands more than 30 years ago, and somehow it had been waiting for me all this time. What could Eleanor have kept inside a box I built decades ago? As Daniel carefully placed it on the counter between us, I realized the greatest secret of my wife's life wasn't hidden inside the store. It was waiting for me to find the courage to open it. The promise she carried alone. For several long seconds, I couldn't bring myself to touch the cedar box. It rested on the old oak counter between Daniel and me, no larger than a family Bible, its corners softened by decades of careful hands. I recognized every detail. The tiny scratch beside the brass latch, the knot in the cedar lid shaped like a teardrop. I'd built it during our first summer in the store from leftover cedar boards that were too beautiful to throw away. When I gave it to Eleanor, she laughed. So this is where you'll hide your fishing money? She teased. I laughed back. No, this is where you'll hide your secrets. She smiled, running her hand across the smooth wood. Not secrets, Walter. The things that matter. At the time, I thought she was only being sentimental. Now those words carried a weight I wasn't prepared for. I rested my hand on the lid, but couldn't lift it. The warm afternoon sunlight streamed to the front windows, catching tiny specks of dust drifting through the air. Somewhere outside, the old brass bell above the front door jingled softly as the breeze nudged it, and for one impossible moment, I could almost hear Eleanor humming while another tray of cinnamon rolls baked in the little kitchen behind me. I closed my eyes. Part of me wanted answers. Another part wished the box had stayed closed forever, because once I opened it, there'd be no going back. You said she trusted you. I said quietly, looking at Daniel. If that's true, why didn't she tell me? Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at the cedar box and slowly nodded. I asked her that once. My eyes met his. What did she say? A gentle smile crossed his face. She looked out that front window for a long time before answering. He paused. Then she said, "Some conversations need time before hearts are ready to carry them." The words sounded exactly like Eleanor. Never dramatic, never complicated, just quietly wise. Daniel continued. She wasn't trying to keep you in the dark, Mr. Carter. She was trying to protect the peace she'd spent a lifetime helping you find. I lowered my eyes. For years, I believed I understood my wife completely. Now I realized there were entire chapters of her heart I'd never thought to read. Not because she shut me out, but because I'd stopped asking the deeper questions. Daniel gently slid the box a few inches closer. She checked on it every single visit. She dusted herself. Sometimes she'd just sit right here with a cup of coffee, smiling at it without saying a word. A lump formed in my throat. 31 years, hundreds of miles, dozens of quiet trips, all carrying something she believed would one day find its way back to me. I drew a slow breath. Then, with hands that suddenly felt much older than they had that morning, I lifted the brass latch. It clicked open with the same familiar sound I'd heard more than 3 decades ago. Inside were neatly bundled letters tied with faded blue ribbon, old photographs, a recipe card stained with cinnamon, a small notebook filled with Eleanor's handwriting, and resting carefully on top, a single white envelope. Across the front, in the handwriting I'd recognize anywhere, were 6 simple words. For my Walter, when you're ready. My vision blurred. I carefully picked up the envelope. The paper felt fragile between my fingers. Whatever Eleanor wanted me to know, it wasn't about another mystery. It was about finally understanding the burden she'd quietly carried alone. As I unfolded the first letter, I expected to read a goodbye. Instead, Eleanor's opening words revealed the heartbreaking reason she had kept returning to Ashford, and why she believed protecting me was the greatest promise she would ever keep. The letter that changed everything. For a long moment, I simply stared at the envelope. My thumb rested beneath the flap, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. This was the last conversation I would ever have with Eleanor. Once I read her words, there would be no asking questions, no hearing her laugh drift through the kitchen, no watching her insist the cinnamon rolls were a little too brown, even while customers lined up to buy every last one. I unfolded the letter with trembling hands. The familiar curve of her handwriting blurred almost instantly behind my tears. My dearest Walter, if you're reading this, then you finally came back to the place that always felt like home. I only wish I could have been sitting beside you when you opened this. I stopped to steady my breathing. Daniel quietly moved toward the front window, giving me the privacy Eleanor would have wanted. I took another breath and continued. There's something I've wanted to tell you for a very long time. Not because I want to keep a secret from you, but because I love you too much to place another burden on your shoulders. My hands tightened around the paper. When the doctors first told me I had cancer, I sat in my car for nearly an hour with your name on my phone. I started to call you more times than I can count. Every time, I pictured the look on your face, and I couldn't press the button. A tear slipped onto the page. I remembered everything you'd already carried. Your mother's long illness, the endless years of work, the weight of always believing you had to be the strong one for everyone else. Then I watched retirement slowly give something back to you that life had stolen. Peace. I lowered the letter for a moment. She had noticed things about me that I hadn't even noticed myself. I kept reading. You started sleeping through the night again. You smiled more often. You spent quiet afternoons in the garage making little wooden shelves simply because it made you happy. I couldn't bear the thought of watching that peace disappear before it had a chance to fully return. My chest ached. She hadn't hidden the truth because she doubted me. She'd hidden it because she knew me. I whispered, almost to myself, she was trying to protect me. Daniel looked over quietly. I asked her once why she wouldn't tell you. I looked up. What did she say? A gentle smile crossed his face. She said, Walter has spent his whole life carrying other people's pain. If I can carry this one for a little while longer, then that's what love asks of me. I couldn't answer. There was nothing to argue with, nothing to forgive, only love, expressed in a way I never expected. I finished the letter and folded it carefully along its original creases. Then I simply stood there. My hand rested on the old oak counter we built together all those years ago. The wood was smooth beneath my fingertips, polished by thousands of customers and countless memories. The late afternoon sunlight stretched across the worn floorboards, and somewhere outside, the old brass bell gave another soft ring in the breeze. For the first time since Eleanor's funeral, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like she was still gently pointing me towards something I hadn't been able to see before. After several quiet minutes, Daniel finally spoke. "There are more letters." I nodded but didn't reach for them. Not yet. Instead, my eyes wandered around the store. Every restored shelf, every freshly painted wall, every flower by the front window. I suddenly realized none of it had happened by accident. This wasn't simply an old store someone had maintained. It was a living proof of everything Eleanor believed, that kindness, patiently given, could outlast the person who offered it. Daniel reached into the cedar box and carefully picked up another envelope. He didn't hand it to me. He simply rested it on the counter. "I think this one answers a question you've been asking since you arrived." I looked down at Eleanor's handwriting, then back around the room she had quietly kept alive for all those years. I finally understood. I hadn't come back to discover a secret. I'd come back to discover her legacy. The next letter revealed something I never imagined. Eleanor hadn't quietly changed just one man's life. She had spent years building a legacy of compassion that continued to touch people long after she drove back to Cincinnati. And somehow, I had never seen it. The seed she left behind. I didn't reach for another letter. Somehow, it didn't feel right. Eleanor had already said everything my heart could handle for one afternoon. Instead, I carefully folded the letter, placed it back inside the cedar box, and rested my hand on the old oak counter, though it felt smooth beneath my fingertips. I remembered building it late one summer night after the children had gone to bed. I'd insisted every corner had to be perfect. Eleanor had leaned against the doorway, laughing. "Walter, customers are buying groceries, not inspecting furniture." "I know," I'd answered without looking up. "But I'll know if it's crooked." She had smiled that quiet smile I loved so much. "That's one of the reasons I married you." The memory made me chuckle. Daniel noticed. Mrs. Eleanor talked about that counter all the time. "Oh, mostly about how stubborn you were while building it." I laughed. I was stubborn. I paused. I suppose I still am. For the first time that afternoon, we laughed together. The sound echoed through the little store, and somehow the silence didn't seem quite so heavy anymore. Daniel wandered toward the front window, looking out at the quiet street. "You know," he said after a moment, "Mrs. Eleanor wasn't always as confident as everyone believed." I looked up. "What do you mean?" "The first day she came back to Ashford after all those years, she sat in her car for nearly 15 minutes. She almost drove away." I blinked. "Eleanor?" He nodded. "She told me later she was afraid." Afraid. Nobody needed this place anymore. His eyes drifted toward the old brass bell hanging above the door. But then that bell rang. A little girl had fallen off her bicycle and came in looking for a bandage. Daniel smiled. Mrs. Eleanor cleaned the scrape on her knee, gave her a cookie, and before sunset, 3 neighbors had stopped by just because they saw the door open. He laughed quietly. That evening she looked around the store and said, "Maybe all this place ever needed was for someone willing to unlock the door." For a moment, I simply stared at the floorboards. I'd always thought courage meant never being afraid. Eleanor had quietly shown me something different. Sometimes courage was unlocking the door anyway. Just then, the brass bell rang. An elderly woman stepped inside, carrying a warm apple pie. "Daniel," she called warmly. I heard Walter finally made it back. Daniel greeted her with a smile. "Rose, I'd like you to meet him." She walked over, flowers still dusting the sleeve of her sweater. "So you're the man who built these shelves." "I guess I am." She ran her fingers gently across the worn cedar. "They've carried more than groceries over the years." She set the pie on the counter. 5 years ago, after my husband passed away, I packed everything I owned. I was leaving Ashford. There wasn't much left here for me. She paused, taking a slow breath. That morning, your wife knocked on my door. She didn't try to convince me to stay. She didn't tell me everything would be okay. She simply sat beside me on my porch. Rose smiled softly. After a while, it started raining. I remember apologizing because I didn't even think to invite her inside. I kept expecting her to leave, but she didn't. We sat there together until the rain stopped. The only thing she said before she went home was, "You don't have to decide what the rest of your life looks like today. Just let tomorrow have a chance." Rose wiped away a tear. I unpacked every box the next morning. Silence settled over the room. I smiled to myself. That sounded exactly like Eleanor. She never hurried people toward hope. She simply stayed long enough for hope to find them. Rose reached into her handbag and handed me a faded photograph. It showed Eleanor kneeling beside a little boy as they planted wildflowers along the edge of the porch. On the back, she'd written, "Walter always says flowers grow where they're cared for. I think people do too." I laughed quietly. "I really said that?" Rose smiled. "Apparently you inspired more of her than you ever realized." I looked at the photograph again. Instead of feeling the ache of everything I'd lost, I felt grateful. Grateful that the woman I loved had left so much goodness behind. Grateful that, even now, she was still bringing people together. Outside, another vehicle rolled slowly into the gravel parking lot. Daniel glanced through the front window. "They're here," he said softly. I looked toward the door. "Who?" Rose smiled but said nothing. A moment later, the brass bell rang again. One by one, families, veterans, children, and neighbors began stepping to the front door. As I watched them gather inside the old store, I realized they hadn't come because of the building. They had come because one woman's kindness had become a tradition, and somehow, without realizing it, I had just become part of it again. The Saturday they all came home. The brass bell above the door rang again. Then again, and again. I stepped away from the counter as more people wandered into the little store. An elderly veteran carried a tin of homemade cookies. A young couple arrived with 2 laughing children. A teenage boy walked in holding a well-worn wooden toolbox. Neighbors greeted one another with warm smiles, as though they had been coming here forever. Before long, the little store was full. Some hugged Daniel. Others greeted Rose like family. A few glanced my way with kind, curious smiles. I leaned toward Daniel. "Did Eleanor invite everyone here today?" He shook his head. "Not today." "Then why are they here?" He smiled. "Because it's Saturday." I must have looked puzzled because Rose laughed softly. For 11 years, this store opened on the last Saturday of every month. No advertisements. No phone calls. People simply knew. If someone needed a porch repaired, groceries delivered, or just someone to sit with them over coffee. She looked around the room. This is where they came. I watched quietly. No one seemed to be in charge. One man started a pot of coffee. 2 teenagers unfolded extra chairs. Someone tightened the loose hinge on the front screen door without being asked. Everyone simply noticed what needed doing and did it. Just then, a little girl no older than 8 walked over carrying a tiny watering can painted with yellow daisies. "Mr. Walter?" "Yes." "My grandma said these are Eleanor's flowers." She pointed toward the flower beds beside the porch. "Can I water them?" A smile spread across my face. I think she liked that very much. The little girl skipped outside, carefully watering each flower as though every blossom mattered. I watched her for a long moment. Eleanor would have loved that. Behind me, Rose chuckled. Those flowers almost didn't survive their first year. I turned. "They didn't." She laughed. "Every single one died." I couldn't help laughing, too. Eleanor stood out there with muddy shoes, hands on her hips, and said, "Well, I suppose even flowers deserve a second chance." The room filled with gentle laughter. I wiped my eyes. That sounded exactly like my wife. She gave everyone else endless patience. She just needed a little help remembering to give some to herself. The next spring, Rose continued. The neighborhood planted them together. Now everyone helps take care of them. I looked through the front window. Those flowers weren't blooming because Eleanor had perfect hands. They were blooming because she'd inspired many hands to care for them. Daniel lightly touched my shoulder. There's someone I'd like you to meet. He led me over to the teenage boy carrying the wooden toolbox. This is Ethan. The young man smiled. It's an honor to finally meet you, Mr. Carter. I've heard a lot about you. You have? I asked. He nodded. Mrs. Eleanor always said I learned patience from your woodworking plans. I blinked. My plans? Daniel smiled. She found your old notebooks. Every project had little notes written in the margins. Measure twice. Take your time. The pieces fit better when you don't rush. Ethan laughed. Mrs. Eleanor said those weren't just instructions for building shelves. They were instructions for building a life. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I'd spent years thinking those old notebooks had been forgotten. Instead, without realizing it, a small part of me had been quietly helping people too. Ethan opened his toolbox. Inside were neatly arranged chisels, measuring tapes, and well-used hand tools. I almost quit the first day. I hit my thumb with a hammer and told Mrs. Eleanor I wasn't meant to build anything. What did she say? I asked. He smiled. She picked up my crooked birdhouse and said, "The birds won't care if it's perfect. They'll only care that someone built them a home." I've never forgotten that. He gently closed the toolbox. Now I teach woodworking every summer. Not because I'm the best carpenter, but because someone believed I could become one. As the afternoon unfolded, laughter drifted through the store. Children carried cookies from table to table. Neighbors shared stories. Someone placed an old record on the player, and soft music floated through the room. For the first time since Eleanor's funeral, I didn't feel like a man surrounded by memories. I felt like a man surrounded by the living proof that her kindness had taken root. Then the sound of tires crunching across the gravel parking lot slowly drew everyone's attention. The conversations softened. Daniel glanced toward the front window. Rose quietly followed his gaze. Even before the truck came to a stop, I knew it was David. My son climbed out, a leather folder tucked beneath his arm. He thought he'd come to help me sell an old building. He had no idea he was about to meet the family his mother had quietly built over 11 years. As David reached the door, the old brass bell rang once more. He stepped inside expecting to talk about paperwork, but instead found a room full of strangers whose lives had been changed by his mother. Before he left Ashford that evening, he would have to decide whether the value of this little store could ever be measured in dollars. The choice that became ours. The brass bell gave a familiar chime as David stepped inside. He stopped just beyond the doorway. Instead of finding an empty building waiting to be sold, he found a room filled with conversation, fresh coffee, and neighbors greeting one another like old friends. His eyes found mine. "Dad." Then he noticed Daniel, Rose, children laughing around the table, the veteran talking with Ethan near the window. Slowly, the leather folder in his hand slipped to his side. I wasn't expecting any of this. I smiled. Neither was I. Rose walked over carrying a plate of warm apple pie. "Welcome home." David accepted it with a shy smile. "I haven't had homemade pie since Mom." His voice faded. Rose simply nodded. I thought today might be a good day to change that. The room quietly returned to its conversations. No speeches. No awkward introductions. Just people making space for another person. David looked around, still trying to understand. Ethan walked over carrying his old wooden toolbox. "Mr. Carter?" David turned. "I'm Ethan. I've wanted to thank your family for a long time." He opened the toolbox and carefully lifted out a small birdhouse. The paint had faded. One corner leaned slightly. "I built this here when I was 12. David smiled. "You kept it all these years?" I almost threw it away. Ethan gently turned the birdhouse in his hands. "But your mom picked it up, dusted it off, and set it on that windowsill." He pointed toward the front window. "For 3 months she left it there. Every time another child walked in, she'd point to it and say, 'Someone built this with their own 2 hands.'" He laughed. I finally stopped seeing mistakes. I started seeing progress. David looked quietly at the little birdhouse. Then he looked at me. I never knew. I placed a hand on his shoulder. I think your mother hoped we'd discover these things when we were ready. Before either of us could say more, a loud scraping sound echoed from the corner of the room. One of the old wooden chairs had finally given way beneath an elderly veteran. Nobody was hurt. The man laughed first. Well, he said, I guess this chair finally retired. The whole room joined in. Without thinking, David stepped forward. Hold on. He picked up the chair and looked toward Ethan. Can we fix it? Ethan grinned. I was hoping you'd ask. The two of them carried it to the old workbench at the back of the store. I watched in silence as Ethan handed David a screwdriver. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke much, which scraped softly against wood. A loose joint was tightened. A crack support was replaced. The sound reminded me of evenings in my own garage years ago. Finally, Ethan stepped back. There. David carefully tested the chair. Solid again. The veteran smiled as he sat down. Better than new. The room answered with quiet applause. I felt something shift inside me. Not sadness, not regret. Something gentler. Pride. Not because my son had repaired an old chair, but because he'd stepped in without being asked. Just like Eleanor always had. Daniel walked over beside me. She would have loved seeing that. I smiled. I think she already does. As the afternoon slowly gave way to evening, neighbors began washing coffee cups, folding chairs, and sweeping the old wooden floor. Nobody gave instructions. Everyone simply noticed what needed to be done. David quietly picked up the leather folder he brought with him. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he closed it. I don't think we came here to sell a building. I looked at the old brass keys resting in my palm. The same keys Eleanor had carried every spring and every fall. Together, David and I walked the front door. As the sun dipped below the trees, I unlocked it once more. Then I reached beside the frame and switched on the porch light. Its warm glow stretched across the porch just as the evening settled over Ashford. David stood beside me, looking out at the neighbors talking and laughing together. After a long silence, he quietly said, I think Mom knew this light was never for the building. I nodded. No, it was always for the people trying to find their way home. That evening, after the last neighbor had gone home and the old brass bell fell silent, Daniel handed me one final item Eleanor had left behind. It wasn't another letter or another secret. It was something far simpler, and asked only one question. Will you keep the door open? The light stays on. By the time the last car pulled away, evening had settled over Ashford. The laughter that filled the store slowly faded into the quiet chirping of crickets outside. Rose hugged me before leaving. You'll be back next month, she said with a hopeful smile. I looked at her. I think so. She smiled. I wasn't asking. We both laughed. One by one, the lights inside the store were switched off until only the warm glow from the porch light spilled through the front window. Daniel stood beside the old oak counter. There's one last thing. He reached beneath the counter and placed a small wooden sign in front of me. It wasn't fancy, just a simple cedar board with neatly carved words. I recognized it immediately. I made this, I whispered. Daniel nodded. You did. Mrs. Eleanor found it in your garage years ago. The carving read, Everyone is welcome here. I never finished it, I said quietly. There wasn't any paint on it. Daniel smiled. She always said it didn't need paint. The words were enough. For a long moment, I simply held the sign. How many things had I started, only for Eleanor to quietly give them life? David walked over and rested a hand on my shoulder. Dad, I owe Mom an apology. I looked at him. So do I? I spent months wondering what she'd left us. He looked around the little store. I never stopped to notice who she'd left us. The room fell silent, not an empty silence, a peaceful one. The next morning, neither of us drove home. Instead, we stayed. The porch steps needed new boards. One window refused to close properly. The garden beds were crowded with weeds. Without saying much, David picked up a hammer. I grabbed a paint scraper. Daniel brought fresh lumber. By lunchtime, Ethan arrived with his toolbox. Rose came carrying sandwiches. Before long, 2 teenagers stopped by to pull weeds. Then the veteran arrived with a ladder. Nobody had been called. Nobody expected to be paid. They simply noticed work that needed doing and showed up, standing there. I realized something Eleanor had understood long before I ever did. Buildings aren't kept alive by wood and nails. They're kept alive by the people who walk through their doors. The seasons quietly came and went. Before I realized it, a full year had passed. The old store had found a new purpose. On Saturday mornings, children gathered around the workbench to learn woodworking. Rose filled the kitchen with the smell of fresh cinnamon rolls, always laughing when the first batch came out a little too dark. The flower beds grew brighter every spring because neighbors planted them together. Some people came for coffee. Some came because they needed a helping hand. Others came simply because they didn't want to be alone. And every person who walked through the door was welcomed like family. One autumn evening, I stood on the porch as the sun slipped behind the trees. The brass bell swayed gently in the breeze. Children laughed inside the store. I reached over and switched on the porch light. Just then, I noticed a little boy standing at the bottom of the steps. His backpack looked almost bigger than he was. He stared at the open doorway but didn't move. I smiled and opened the door a little wider. "You look like you've had a long day." He nodded without saying a word. "Come on in. I think there's still some warm cinnamon rolls in the kitchen." He hesitated for only a second before climbing the steps. As he walked through the doorway, the old brass bell rang once again. I smiled, gently closed the door behind him, and switched on one more light inside the store. Because that's what Eleanor had been doing all along. Not saving the whole world, just making sure that whenever someone needed a place to belong, the door was open and the light stayed on. The end.